Now, more than 4 grim years after the Russian invasion of Ukraine, we can say today what then seemed unimaginable. Vladimir Putin's mighty war machine has been fought pretty much to a standstill. Russia is losing over 1,000 troops a day, approaching the point where they're being killed and wounded faster than Moscow can replace them. Ukraine is making the pace in a new era of warfare, leading the development of war drones in the air and robots on the battlefield, changing the balance of the war and the nature of modern warfare. Donald Trump, Ukraine's most powerful and often grudging backer, told reporters in Washington that he thinks Ukraine is doing well, that he's impressed, which from Trump counts as high praise. And the Kremlin is reported to no longer see President Trump as interested in brokering peace on terms acceptable to Russia. Now, meanwhile, leaders of Europe's main powers who gathered in Berlin yesterday are promising Ukraine more support. For Ukraine, for European and global security, this feels like a truly significant moment. And on today's drive, I'm going to be bringing you the latest from the diplomatic front and the front line of battle, where drones, tech and AI are showing us today the nature of war tomorrow. A little later, behind the scenes at Westminster in the transition of power between Keir Starmer's premiership and his successor, the Premier presumptive in all but name, Andy Burnham. Wonder what you're thinking. Send me a text, 87222. Start with the word Times or a tweet to @TimesRadio. First, though, President Trump has spoken positively about his Ukrainian counterpart, Volodymyr Zelensky. The US president was asked by reporters during a meeting with NATO chief Mark Rutte in the Oval Office if he considered President Zelensky a winner in the war.
Well, he's doing pretty well. Look, no matter how you look at it, he's doing pretty well. He's holding his own, at least. A lot of people dying on both sides. But I think he's doing pretty well. Look, you have to say he's courageous. He's got great equipment. But he's got great men. He's got fighters.
Praise from President Trump. Now, leaders, including Trump, are going to be travelling to Ankara for the NATO summit in early July, and Ukraine is sure to be high on the agenda. So welcome first to the programme, Catherine Philp, the World Affairs editor at The Times. Hello to you, Catherine.
Hi, John.
Hi. I'm keen to get your thoughts, of course, on the state of play diplomatically between Ukraine, Europe, Russia and America. But in broad terms, first, it is fair to say, do you think, there's a broad sense in which the balance of the war has shifted, if not to the point that Ukraine can be said to be winning, but certainly to the point they're now, well, as Trump said, doing well, performing impressively.
That's right, and I think that in a sense, you could say that you could see a way now how Ukraine could win this, and I think that that's critical to Donald Trump because, as we know, he likes a winner. So he was at the G7 where we started to sense that he indeed, not just the others in NATO, were looking positively at the developments in Ukraine. And Zelensky told the meeting of leaders there that Ukrainian forces had recaptured 100 square meters in a single month on one front. Now, we've known in the last few weeks that Ukraine had started to make net gains. So overall, they have gained more territory than they've lost. But that figure was new and a significant development on the front. But really what's going on with what's really turning the tide of the war for Ukraine right now is these mid and these long range strikes that are making the difference. So the long range strikes are the ones that are happening against Russian oil infrastructure and causing havoc amongst their fuel supplies and causing shortages in Russia. And the mid range strikes are the ones that are hitting their supply lines and making it very difficult for the Russians to actually bring what they need to the troops at the front. But the really dramatic development, I think, on the mid-range ones is in Crimea. And we've seen that over the last few days, Ukraine has repeatedly hit Crimea and the supply lines running to it. And the defense minister in Ukraine has actually vowed that Crimea will soon be an island.
Yeah, and of course Ukraine are taking losses and taking pain in an appalling way. But to see Russia taking strikes deep into its own heartland in the way that it is, and struggling on the front line in the way that it is with the help of the drones and the robots on the ground, it just puts a different complexion on the whole thing. When Catherine, you say it's possible to imagine at least the idea of Ukraine winning, what could Ukraine winning look like?
Well, I think that probably the best Ukraine could hope for now is not having to give up anything that it hasn't already, not having to submit to the kind of demands that Russia was making in Alaska when they had that meeting with Trump last year, at a time when things looked very, very different on the battlefield. And it was felt that Trump really was being very supportive of what Putin was asking, and saying that, that Ukraine would have to suck it up, essentially, and hand over the whole of the Donbass, and possibly even more of the territory that Russia hasn't already taken. I think there's long been a realization in Ukraine that to regain all the territory they've lost would be a massive ask. But they could reach a deal with Russia that, in Putin's eyes, would be a defeat, because his intention was, at the very least, to take Donbass. And if he can't do that, then I think there is a world in which we could say Ukraine would have won.
It's been so interesting, hasn't it, to see, summit after summit, the President Trump, coming out with what seems to be a sympathetic take on the Russian position, having just taken a phone call from Vladimir Putin just before whatever the meeting happened to be. And now we're hearing that the president can have a meeting, and instead of listening hard and reflecting what Putin says, he's rather biting. He's standing and saying, look, you need to come to the table, you need to negotiate. And then you have Sergei Lavrov, reported to have said that he no longer sees, or Russia no longer sees, Trump as pushing for a peace acceptable to Russia. These things are potentially interesting and important.
Absolutely. I mean, look, it's only a year ago that Trump walked out of the G7 summit in Canada. And one of the issues was over Ukraine. He wasn't interested in discussing it anymore and just wanted it to end. There was no statement that came out of that meeting. It had to be put out by the Canadians. And the French feared that something similar would happen this time. So they they concocted a statement that they said the French presidency would put out. But actually, as it happened, Trump stayed throughout the G7. He was very pleased with himself over the Iran deal and the fact that when he presented it to the other members of the G7, that they spoke very flatteringly about it to him. So he was in a good mood because of that. He then spoke about a willingness to reimpose sanctions on Russia, including those on the oil sector, which had been lifted because of the Iran war. And he essentially took a different tone. Now, we can't say that won't change when he gets on the boat to Vladimir Putin, but this is very much dismayed that Moscow, the Kremlin, and Lavrov was speaking in response to what Trump had said at the G7, saying, well, we need to speak to Trump to find out if America's position really has changed, or if it hasn't. And so, that's, I guess, the next stumbling block is when Trump himself speaks directly to Putin. Will he hold this apparent line that he seemed to cleave to at the G7? But I think it's really important to remember he's just come out of his own war. He's experienced something himself, and had to get to a deal with Iran. And I think that's changed the complexion, not just for him, but of the circumstances, the backdrop against which this war is happening. Don't forget that Russia was an ally of Iran's in that fight against its Gulf neighbors and against the US and Israel. So he's been on the other side of the battlefield for a while, and it may have changed his perspective. It certainly changed some of the geopolitics surrounding this.
Yes.
It's certainly things like now easing in the Middle East, and that's going to bring the oil price back down again. That changes things for Russia too. Okay,
well, I also see that President Trump's son-in-law and his former business partner, now his envoys, Jared Kushner and Steve Witkoff, may be heading to Moscow before long, but I suppose we should contain our expectations of what may come out of that. Catherine Philp, great to talk to you. Let's talk again soon. And Catherine is the World Affairs Editor, of course, of The Times. Now on the line, Fabrice Pothier, the former Director of Policy Planning at NATO. Hello to you, Fabrice.
Hi, John. How are you doing?
I'm well, thank you. What is your assessment of the state of the war now?
Well, I kind of agree with the previous comments that there's been a change in the, as we say in French, the rapport de force, the position of strengths of the various parties. And it is true that the Ukrainians have built more pressure points on and against Russia, both in deep strikes inside the Russian territory, but also increasingly along the front line, including Crimea. And it is also true that the Europeans, and we should not forget that, have done their homework, or at least enough of it, to really be able now to be in a stronger position and have more leverage, both vis-à-vis Russia, but also vis-à-vis Trump. And Trump, as you said earlier, only respects power and strengths. And he's maybe a little bit weaker than he was, as the previous commentator said, than before because of the Iran fiasco. So I think there's been a better now shuffling of the cards. However, and this I would be cautious here, let's not just buy into too much spin about the Ukrainians being able to regain the advantage. I think the Ukrainians have managed to very smartly, very persistently create those pressure points on their adversary, but they have not managed, and it's unlikely to be able to produce a decisive outcome.
Yes.
Where you can say there is, a complete breaking of the Russian lines. Putin is willing to make huge compromise because he's not known for that. He's willing to go always further than the others. So we need to be cautious, but it could be putting them in a position where they can hopefully get a better outcome into a peace negotiations.
No, I mean, your qualifications are well taken. I mean, and I suppose we can hope for, but we should not expect a significant shift in Ukraine's favour from Donald Trump, I suppose.
Well, I think there are many things here. There's the reality of Trump's bandwidth, which is obviously being very consumed by the war against Iran and obviously also the midterm elections in the United States. And therefore, he's got much less bandwidth to put on trying to solve in his way Russia's illegal war against Ukraine. What is true is that there is also an ideological alignment that Trump has with Vladimir Putin. And I think we have underestimated this. But not only he's attracted to Putin, like he's attracted to Xi Jinping, because he's a strong man and he's attracted to strong, powerful political leader, but he's also, I think, from a value point of view, he buys into the Russian narrative that the Russians are the last ones who are holding this kind of Orthodox Christianity and pure values. And that works a lot with some of the MAGA narrative. So he might always go back to Putin, but right now, his reality is that he needs to be more aligned with the Europeans and the Ukrainians.
All right, Fabrice Pothier, great to talk to you. Thank you. Fabrice is the former Director of Policy Planning at NATO.